By the middle of 1943, the Allied air campaign against Germany had reached a scale unprecedented in the history of warfare. Thousands of heavy bombers operated from bases in Britain and the Mediterranean, supported by a growing system of escorts, radar, and industrial logistics. For the United States Army Air Forces, strategic bombing was not merely a supporting effort. It was conceived as an independent instrument capable of crippling Germany's capacity to wage war. The underlying assumption was clear and doctrinally explicit. Precision bombing of key industrial nodes, aircraft factories, ball bearing plants, oil refineries, transportation hubs, would paralyze German production, undermine military effectiveness, and accelerate collapse without the need for prolonged ground combat. Air power, properly applied, was expected to achieve strategic results disproportionate to its cost. These assumptions were not speculative. They were embedded in pre-war American air doctrine, validated through theoretical studies, and reinforced by early wartime analysis. Strategic bombing was framed as a rational, technologically enabled solution to the problem of industrial war. Germany, as an advanced industrial state, appeared uniquely vulnerable to this approach. Yet, by the end of 1944, the evidence told a different story. Despite sustained bombing, German war production did not collapse. In several key sectors, output actually increased, even as cities were destroyed and infrastructure degraded. The German military continued to field aircraft, tanks, and munitions at levels sufficient to prolong the war on multiple fronts. The failure of strategic bombing to break Germany was not the result of a single flaw or miscalculation. It emerged from the interaction of doctrine, intelligence limitations, enemy adaptation, and structural realities of industrial warfare. German production systems proved more resilient than anticipated. Air defenses adapted faster than planners expected, and the relationship between physical destruction and strategic effect proved far less direct than theory assumed. This topic matters because it challenges one of the central beliefs of modern air power. Strategic bombing did not fail tactically. It inflicted massive destruction and imposed real costs. What it failed to do was translate that destruction into decisive strategic outcome on its own terms. Understanding why requires examining not only what was bombed, but how assumptions were formed, how Germany responded, and why industrial systems under total war conditions behaved differently than predicted. This analysis is not an indictment of airmen or technology. It is a study of how doctrine confronts reality in large-scale industrial war. The failure of strategic bombing to break Germany cannot be understood without first examining the doctrine that defined how American air power was expected to work. Long before the first bombs fell on German cities, the United States Army Air Forces had developed a coherent, internally consistent theory of victory through air attack. This theory shaped target selection, force structure, and operational priorities throughout the European air war. At the core of American doctrine was the belief that modern industrial states were systems held together by a limited number of critical nodes. If those nodes could be identified and destroyed, the entire system would collapse. This concept was developed during the interwar period by officers associated with the Air Corps Tactical School and later institutionalized within the United States Army Air Forces. It assumed that industrial production depended on a small set of key inputs: electric power, transportation, oil, and specialized components, whose loss would have cascading effects. American planners believed that heavy bombers, flying in daylight and equipped with precision bomb sights, could strike these nodes directly. This belief distinguished U.S. doctrine from British area bombing. The objective was not morale collapse through destruction of cities, but functional paralysis through selective destruction. The emphasis on precision was both ethical and operational. Precision promised efficiency, economy of force, and strategic decisiveness. This theory was formalized in pre-war planning documents produced by the Air War Plans Division. These plans identified target systems rather than individual factories. Aircraft production, ball bearings, oil refining, and transportation networks were prioritized because they were believed to be indispensable and difficult to replace. If bombers could destroy these systems faster than Germany could repair or adapt them, collapse would follow. Crucially, the doctrine assumed that bombing accuracy would be sufficient to achieve these effects. Training, technology, and formation tactics were expected to compensate for enemy defenses and weather. Losses were anticipated, but they were framed as acceptable in light of decisive results. Strategic bombing was presented not as a supplement to ground war, but as a parallel path to victory. These assumptions shaped force design. The United States invested heavily in long-range heavy bombers, capable of carrying large payloads deep into enemy territory. Escort fighters were initially viewed as unnecessary or secondary, based on the belief that bomber formations could defend themselves through concentrated firepower. This belief would later prove costly, but it was logically consistent within the doctrinal framework. The doctrine also assumed that German industry lacked flexibility. Planners believed production was centralized, specialized, and vulnerable to disruption. They underestimated the capacity of German industry to disperse facilities, substitute components, and reorganize labor. The possibility that destruction might lead to adaptation rather than collapse was not central to planning assumptions. Intelligence estimates reinforced this confidence. Pre-war and early wartime assessments relied on limited data, peacetime production models, and assumptions drawn from American industrial experience. Germany was treated as a rational industrial actor, operating under constraints similar to those of the United States. The effects of authoritarian control, forced labor, and emergency reorganization were insufficiently understood. Another critical assumption concerned time. Strategic bombing doctrine envisioned a relatively rapid effect. Once key systems were degraded, production was expected to fall quickly and irreversibly. This expectation shaped campaign planning and evaluation.
Bombing effectiveness was measured by physical damage to targets rather than by long-term system performance. When the bombing campaign began in earnest, early results appeared to validate doctrinal expectations. Individual factories were destroyed, urban areas burned, and German defenses were visibly strained. These early signals reinforced confidence within the air forces that the theory was sound and that greater scale would produce decisive results. What doctrine did not fully account for was the interaction between bombing and enemy response. German air defense, industrial dispersion, labor mobilization, and repair capacity were dynamic systems, each adapted in response to pressure. Strategic bombing was not acting on a static target set, but on an adversary actively reorganizing under attack. This disconnect between doctrinal expectation and systemic reality would define the outcome of the air war. Strategic bombing did immense damage, but damage alone was not the variable that determined German capacity to fight. Production systems absorbed shocks, compensated for loss, and in some cases, increased output under pressure. Part 1 establishes the analytical foundation of the problem. Strategic bombing failed to break Germany not because the doctrine was irrational, but because it rested on assumptions about industrial fragility, accuracy, and response time that did not hold under conditions of total war. The next part will examine how these assumptions collided with operational reality once the bombing campaign reached full scale.
When the strategic bombing campaign reached sustained intensity, the assumptions that underpinned American air doctrine encountered constraints that were operational rather than theoretical. By 1943, daylight raids by the United States Army Air Forces were being conducted at a scale sufficient, in theory, to produce decisive effects. In practice, the interaction of accuracy limits, enemy adaptation, and assessment error reduced the campaign's strategic yield. The first constraint was accuracy. Precision bombing depended on visual identification, stable formations, and predictable conditions. Over Germany, these prerequisites were rarely met. Weather degraded visibility, smoke and dust obscured aim points, navigation errors accumulated over long distances, and defensive maneuvering disrupted bomb runs. As a result, bomb dispersion was substantial. Even when raids were classified as successful, a significant portion of ordnance fell outside intended target areas, diluting effects on specific industrial systems. Loss rates compounded this problem. Early unescorted raids revealed that bomber formations could not reliably defend themselves against coordinated interception. Casualties forced tactical adjustments, higher altitudes, tighter formations, altered routes that further reduced accuracy. The requirement to balance survivability against effectiveness produced a trade-off doctrine had not fully anticipated. German air defense adapted rapidly. The integrated system combining radar, fighter control, and flak improved with each encounter. Interceptors learned bomber habits, flak belts were repositioned, command and control shortened reaction times. The defender's learning curve narrowed the window in which precision effects could be achieved, even as Allied sortie numbers increased. More consequential was the behavior of German industry under attack. Doctrine assumed centralized production vulnerable to node failure. In reality, industry dispersed. Large plants were broken into smaller workshops. Production was shifted geographically. Redundancy replaced specialization. Underground facilities and decentralized subcontracting reduced exposure. These adaptations did not eliminate inefficiency, but they prevented cascade failure. Labor policy further offset damage. Emergency mobilization, extended shifts, and the expansion of forced labor compensated for disruption. Output was prioritized ruthlessly. Non-essential production was curtailed to preserve military manufacturing. These measures imposed human and efficiency costs, but they sustained throughput under bombardment. Target system attacks exposed the same dynamic. Ball bearings, oil, and transportation were identified as critical vulnerabilities. Raids inflicted heavy damage and produced short-term disruption, yet stockpiles, substitution, rerouting, and rapid repair blunted long-term effects. The transportation network, in particular, proved resilient through redundancy and improvisation until very late in the war, when bombing effects finally aligned with fuel shortages and ground advances. Assessment practices obscured these realities. Bomb damage assessment emphasized visible destruction, burned cities, ruined factories, over functional outcomes. Cratered facilities were equated with lost capacity, even when production resumed elsewhere. Feedback loops reinforced confidence in the approach. Destruction validated doctrine. Doctrine justified continued destruction. Measures of success lagged behind systemic performance. The result was diminishing returns. Increased bombing intensity generated increased dispersal and hardening, which reduced the marginal effect of each additional raid. Strategic bombing became a contest of endurance rather than a mechanism of rapid paralysis. Damage accumulated, but decisive leverage did not. Part 2 thus explains why scale did not deliver collapse. The campaign confronted a dynamic opponent whose industrial system adapted faster than doctrine anticipated, while assessment methods overstated progress. The next phase will examine how intelligence gaps and misinterpretation prolonged this trajectory, and why only the late alignment of bombing with fuel scarcity and ground operations produced decisive effects. As the strategic bombing campaign continued, a critical weakness emerged, not in execution, but in how results were interpreted and fed back into planning. Intelligence, assessment methods, and institutional incentives combined to produce a distorted picture of effectiveness. This phase examines how misinterpretation of data sustained confidence in a strategy whose decisive impact remained elusive. Bomb damage assessment became the primary mechanism for evaluating success. After each major raid, reconnaissance imagery and reports were used to estimate destruction. Factories reduced to rubble, transportation hubs cratered, and urban areas burned were recorded as indicators of progress. These assessments were visually compelling and operationally convenient. However, they measured physical damage rather than functional output.
This distinction proved decisive. German production was not tied rigidly to individual facilities. Output often resumed in dispersed locations, substitute plants, or temporary workshops. A destroyed factory did not necessarily equate to destroyed capacity. Yet assessment frameworks treated facility damage as a proxy for systemic failure. The lag between destruction and measurable output decline was interpreted as delayed effect rather than evidence of resilience. Intelligence gaps compounded the problem. Allied analysts had limited visibility into German emergency production methods, labor mobilization, and internal reorganization. Authoritarian control enabled rapid reallocation of resources without transparency. As a result, production increases in key sectors appeared anomalous rather than contradictory. When output rose despite bombing, explanations emphasized time lag, reporting error, or future collapse rather than revisiting assumptions. Institutional incentives reinforced this interpretation. Strategic bombing was not simply one tool among many, it was a defining mission of the air forces. Questioning its effectiveness threatened budgets, force structure, and organizational identity. Success was therefore framed in terms consistent with doctrine. Evidence that supported the theory was amplified. Evidence that challenged it was contextualized or deferred. This feedback loop shaped target selection. When expected effects did not materialize, the response was often to bomb more intensely or expand the target set, rather than reassess underlying assumptions. The campaign broadened from discrete industrial nodes to wider systems, including urban areas and transportation. Expansion substituted for revision. The problem was not deception, but methodological inertia. Measuring systemic industrial degradation in real time is inherently difficult, especially under wartime conditions. The available metrics favored visible destruction over functional analysis. As long as cities burned and factories lay in ruins, the campaign appeared to be working, even if German military output remained sufficient to sustain combat. Only late in the war did a different picture begin to emerge. Detailed post-war analysis, conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, revealed that production decline correlated less with individual factory destruction than with converging pressures, fuel shortages, transportation breakdowns under combined attack, and the loss of territory to advancing ground forces. Bombing alone had imposed cost, but decisive effects occurred only when multiple constraints aligned. This realization came too late to reshape wartime doctrine. During the campaign, the absence of a clear analytical mechanism to link bombing to systemic collapse meant that strategic bombing continued largely on its own terms. It was judged by effort and destruction rather than by demonstrated strategic leverage. Part 3 thus explains why the campaign persisted despite ambiguous results. Intelligence limitations, assessment bias, and institutional commitment created a self-reinforcing narrative of progress. Strategic bombing did not fail for lack of destruction. It failed to produce the kind of systemic disruption doctrine had promised. In the next part, the analysis will examine how and why bombing only achieved decisive impact when integrated with ground advances and resource denial, rather than as an independent instrument. The strategic impact of the Allied bombing campaign against Germany only became decisive when air attack ceased to operate as an independent instrument and instead converged with ground advances and resource denial. This phase examines why bombing alone failed to produce collapse and why its effects only translated into strategic outcomes when combined with other pressures late in the war. The most important limiting factor was Germany's access to energy. Industrial output, transportation, and military operations all depended on fuel availability. Early bombing efforts treated oil as one target system among many, rather than as a binding constraint across the entire war economy. As a result, attacks on oil facilities were intermittent and often subordinated to other priorities, such as aircraft production or urban industrial areas.
When sustained attacks on oil infrastructure intensified in 1944, the effects were immediate and systemic. Synthetic fuel plants, refineries, and storage facilities could not be dispersed or substituted easily. Unlike machine tools or assembly lines, fuel production required specialized facilities and feedstock. Once damaged, output dropped sharply and remained depressed. This shortage cascaded through the German system, reducing pilot training hours, limiting armored mobility, constraining transportation, and degrading air defense effectiveness. Crucially, these effects were not produced by bombing alone. Ground advances in Western and Eastern Europe eliminated alternative supply routes, captured stockpiles, and compressed Germany's remaining industrial space. The loss of territory reduced flexibility and increased vulnerability. Bombing amplified these losses, but it did not create them independently. Transportation targeting followed a similar pattern. Earlier attacks on rail yards and canals caused disruption, but were rapidly repaired or bypassed.
Only when bombing coincided with the loss of rail hubs to advancing ground forces did transportation breakdown become systemic. At that point, rerouting was no longer possible, and repair capacity was overwhelmed. Movement of coal, raw materials, and finished goods slowed dramatically, constraining production across sectors. This convergence reveals a critical insight. Strategic bombing was most effective as a force multiplier rather than as a standalone strategy. Its decisive impact depended on the presence of complementary constraints that limited enemy adaptation. Without those constraints, Germany absorbed damage and reorganized. With them, bombing accelerated collapse already underway. The timing of these effects also mattered. By the time bombing achieved systemic leverage, Germany's strategic position was already irrecoverable. The campaign shortened the war and reduced German operational capacity, but it did not determine the outcome independently. Ground forces, territorial loss, and resource exhaustion remained decisive variables. This does not mean bombing was irrelevant. It imposed continuous pressure, forced costly adaptations, and degraded combat effectiveness over time. However, its contribution was cumulative and conditional, not decisive in isolation. The belief that bombing could break Germany on its own terms overstated the relationship between destruction and control. Part 4 therefore clarifies the central failure of strategic bombing doctrine. It misidentified independence as strength. Air power was most effective when integrated into a broader system of constraints that denied the enemy time, space, and resources. When employed alone against a flexible industrial system, it imposed cost without compelling collapse. In the next part, the analysis will assess why these lessons were not fully integrated during the war itself, and how doctrinal commitment and institutional incentives delayed recognition that bombing required convergence with ground operations to achieve decisive results. The delayed recognition of strategic bombing's limitations was not primarily a technical failure, but an institutional one. This phase examines why evidence accumulated slowly, why doctrinal reassessment lagged behind operational reality, and how organizational commitment shaped the persistence of a strategy whose independent effectiveness remained unproven for most of the war. Strategic bombing had become central to Allied planning long before its results could be empirically tested. For the United States Army Air Forces, it was not simply a method of fighting, but a justification for institutional autonomy, force structure, and resource allocation. Air power promised decisiveness without the attrition of ground warfare. This promise carried strategic appeal at the highest levels of command and government. Once committed at scale, strategic bombing generated its own momentum. Enormous investments in aircraft production, training pipelines, basing infrastructure, and logistics created sunk costs that discouraged reassessment. Adjusting doctrine would have implied that these investments might not deliver the outcomes originally promised. In a total war environment, such implications were institutionally difficult to accept. Operational feedback further complicated reassessment. Bombing produced undeniable destruction, Cities were devastated, factories damaged, and civilian displacement widespread. These outcomes were visible, measurable, and emotionally compelling. They reinforced the perception of effectiveness, even when German military capacity remained intact. The distinction between destruction and strategic effect remained blurred in operational reporting. Command structures also favored continuity. Strategic bombing decisions were made at levels removed from immediate battlefield feedback. Air commanders evaluated success through sortie counts, tonnage dropped, and damage assessments.
Ground commanders evaluated success through territorial gain and enemy collapse. The lag between air effort and ground outcome allowed bombing to be judged largely on its own internal metrics. Another factor was the absence of a clear alternative framework. Strategic bombing doctrine had been developed extensively in the interwar period, while integrated air-ground concepts evolved more gradually. When independent bombing failed to produce rapid results, planners lacked a fully articulated substitute theory. As a result, adaptation tended toward expansion, more targets, more tonnage, rather than conceptual revision. Allied coordination further delayed doctrinal convergence. British and American bombing philosophies differed in method but converged in scale. Night area bombing and daylight precision bombing operated in parallel rather than under a unified strategic logic. This parallelism made it harder to isolate cause and effect. When German production faltered, it was unclear which element or combination was responsible. Only late in 1944 did a clearer pattern emerge. As fuel shortages deepened, transportation broke down, and ground forces advanced into industrial regions, the combined effect became unmistakable. German operational capability deteriorated rapidly. At this point, bombing appeared decisive, but in a context where multiple constraints were acting simultaneously. The independence once claimed for strategic bombing had effectively vanished. Post-war analysis would later confirm this sequence. The bombing campaign had been necessary, costly, and influential, but not independently decisive. It shortened the war by reducing German capacity to resist once other pressures converged. It did not, by itself, force collapse on its own timeline. Part 5 thus explains why strategic bombing persisted as a primary strategy despite mounting ambiguity.
Institutional commitment, sunk costs, compelling but misleading indicators, and the absence of a ready alternative delayed recognition of its limits. The campaign succeeded most when it abandoned its original claim of independence and became part of a broader system of pressure. In the final part, the analysis will synthesize these findings and assess what the failure to break Germany through bombing alone reveals about modern industrial war, doctrinal belief, and the limits of air power as a standalone instrument. The failure of strategic bombing to break Germany ultimately reveals less about air power itself than about the nature of modern industrial war. This final phase synthesizes the preceding analysis and explains why the original promise of decisive, independent air power proved incompatible with the structural realities of total war. Strategic bombing was built on a rational premise that industrial societies depend on interconnected systems vulnerable to targeted disruption. In theory, destroying critical nodes should have produced cascading failure. In practice, Germany demonstrated that industrial systems under existential threat behave differently. Efficiency gave way to survivability. Redundancy replaced optimization. Centralization dissolved into dispersion. These adaptations fundamentally altered the relationship between destruction and outcome. Air power inflicted enormous damage. Cities were devastated, infrastructure degraded, and civilian life shattered. Yet, destruction did not equate to control. German leadership retained the ability to prioritize, redirect, and coerce production long after physical damage reached unprecedented levels. The state's capacity to absorb loss, mobilize labor, and enforce compliance prevented collapse until multiple constraints converged simultaneously. This convergence is the critical insight. Strategic bombing achieved decisive effect
only when it intersected with factors it did not control: territorial loss, fuel scarcity, and ground force advance. These elements compressed German adaptability, removed fallback options, and eliminated time as a resource. Bombing accelerated collapse once these conditions existed, but it did not create them alone. The doctrine's core error was not optimism, but isolation. Strategic bombing was framed as a self-sufficient solution to a systemic problem. In reality, systemic problems require systemic solutions.
Air power could degrade, disrupt, and accelerate, but it could not independently compel surrender against a state still capable of organizing resistance. This does not diminish the operational value of the bombing campaign. It forced Germany into costly defensive adaptations, diverted resources, and reduced combat effectiveness. It shortened the war once other pressures aligned. What it did not do was deliver victory on its own timetable or according to its original theoretical promise. Institutionally, the campaign illustrates how doctrine can outpace evidence. Once embedded, beliefs about decisiveness resisted revision even as outcomes diverged from expectation. Metrics emphasized effort and destruction rather than strategic leverage. Adaptation occurred tactically, but conceptual reassessment lagged until the war's final phase. The broader lesson extends beyond the Second World War. In conflicts decided by production, logistics, and control of systems, no single instrument operates in isolation. Tactical innovation cannot substitute for structural advantage. Attrition without constraint imposes cost, but it does not dictate outcome. In final assessment, strategic bombing failed to break Germany because Germany was not broken by damage alone. It was broken when damage intersected with loss of territory, loss of fuel, and loss of time. Air power was essential to that process, but it was not autonomous. The legacy of the bombing campaign is therefore analytical rather than doctrinal. It demonstrates the power of air forces when integrated and the limits of air power when isolated. It cautions against strategies that promise decisiveness without accounting for enemy adaptation and systemic resilience. Strategic bombing did not lose the war, it helped end it. But it did so only when it ceased to be a theory of independent victory and became part of a broader mechanism of collapse.
The long-term significance of the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany lies not in whether it worked, but in how its results reshaped post-war understanding of air power, doctrine, and modern war. This final phase examines how the campaign was interpreted after 1945, why early conclusions were often overstated, and what the experience ultimately revealed about the limits of strategic bombing as an independent instrument. Immediately after the war, the need for explanation was acute. The scale of effort devoted to bombing, aircraft production, personnel losses, industrial investment, and civilian destruction demanded justification. Early assessments emphasized contribution rather than causality. Strategic bombing was framed as decisive in aggregate, even when evidence showed that its effects were conditional and delayed. This framing reflected both institutional interest and the difficulty of disentangling overlapping pressures in a collapsing enemy system. Post-war analysis gradually introduced greater nuance. Detailed examination of German production data, transportation flows, and fuel availability revealed that bombing rarely produced immediate systemic failure. Instead, it imposed chronic stress that Germany managed through adaptation until external constraints removed flexibility. These findings did not negate the value of bombing, but they narrowed its claim to scope. A key realization was that air power exerted influence primarily by shaping the environment in which other forces operated. Bombing reduced margins, accelerated exhaustion, and magnified the effects of territorial loss. It did not, by itself, force surrender or collapse on a predictable timeline. The decisive variable remained convergence, multiple pressures acting simultaneously on an enemy with diminishing options. This conclusion challenged pre-war and wartime doctrine that had promised independence and decisiveness. Air power proved indispensable, but not autonomous.
Its effectiveness depended on integration with ground operations, naval blockade, and resource denial. When isolated, it imposed cost. When integrated, it accelerated outcome. The German case also highlighted the resilience of industrial systems under authoritarian control. Centralized authority, coercive labor policies, and emergency reorganization enabled production to continue under conditions that would have been crippling in peacetime. Strategic bombing theory underestimated this capacity for survival under pressure. The lesson was not that bombing is futile, but that industrial collapse is harder to induce than predicted. For future planners, the implications were clear. Strategic bombing could not substitute for control of territory, resources, and time. It could degrade and disrupt, but not compel outcome alone. Claims of rapid, decisive victory through air attack required far greater scrutiny, especially against opponents capable of adaptation. In historical perspective, the bombing of Germany stands as a case where expectations exceeded mechanisms. The campaign achieved many of its secondary goals, diverting resources, reducing combat effectiveness, and shortening the war once collapse began. But it failed to deliver on its central promise of independent decisiveness. That failure was not due to insufficient effort or commitment, but to the structural realities of industrial war. The enduring value of this case lies in its clarity. It demonstrates that modern wars are decided by systems rather than strikes, by convergence rather than singular instruments. Strategic bombing mattered, but only as part of a larger process it could not control. In final assessment, strategic bombing failed to break Germany because Germany was not a brittle system waiting to shatter. It was a pressured system that adapted until it was simultaneously constrained from multiple directions. Air power helped create those constraints, but it did not act alone. This conclusion does not diminish the role of airmen or the scale of sacrifice involved. It places that sacrifice within an analytical framework that separates contribution from causation. The lesson is enduring. In modern war, no single domain delivers victory in isolation. The final assessment of the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany rests on a clear analytical distinction between destruction and decision, between effort and effect. Strategic bombing inflicted unprecedented damage, absorbed enormous resources, and shaped the operational environment of the war. What it did not do was independently determine Germany's defeat on the timeline or in the manner its doctrine had promised. The central failure was not technical or moral, but structural. Strategic bombing doctrine assumed that modern industrial systems were inherently fragile, susceptible to collapse if key nodes were destroyed. Germany demonstrated the opposite. Under conditions of total war, industrial systems prioritized survival over efficiency. Production dispersed, substituted, and reorganized. Losses were absorbed unevenly, but persistently. The system degraded, but it did not break until constrained simultaneously by multiple forces beyond bombing's control. This distinction explains why scale did not produce decisiveness. Increasing tonnage, expanding target sets, and intensifying tempo imposed rising costs, but did not generate proportional strategic leverage. Damage accumulated without producing collapse because the enemy retained space, time, labor, and authority to adapt. Bombing alone could not remove these variables. Only when those variables converged, loss of fuel, loss of transportation coherence, loss of territory, and loss of maneuver space, did bombing achieve decisive effect. By that point, Germany's defeat was already structurally assured. Air power accelerated an outcome shaped by ground advance, blockade, and exhaustion. It did not create that outcome independently. The persistence of strategic bombing as an independent strategy reflects the power of doctrine once institutionalized. Pre-war theory shaped expectations. Wartime metrics reinforced belief.
Organizational identity resisted reassessment.
Tactical adaptation occurred continuously, but conceptual revision lagged. The campaign continued not because its independence was proven, but because its independence had been assumed. This does not reduce the importance of the air war. Strategic bombing diverted German resources, degraded combat effectiveness, and shortened the war once collapse began. It imposed constraints that mattered when other pressures aligned. Its contribution was real, but conditional. The enduring lesson is analytical rather than prescriptive. In modern industrial war, victory emerges from system-wide constraint, not from the destruction of individual components alone. Air power is most effective when integrated, when it denies time, space, and recovery in coordination with other forces. When isolated, it imposes cost without control. In final assessment, strategic bombing failed to break Germany because Germany was not defeated by damage alone. It was defeated when damage intersected with irreversible loss of options. Air power played a critical role in that process, but it did not and could not operate as a self-sufficient instrument of victory. This case remains instructive because it clarifies the limits of technological optimism and the dangers of doctrinal certainty. Strategic bombing against Germany stands as a reminder that in total war, effectiveness is determined not by the scale of effort, but by the structure of constraint imposed on the enemy system as a whole.